Greetings, BookTube! We are back. This is Neil Clarke coming to you with Better Worlds Theory BookTube edition. I am joined, as always, by my special guest, The Highway, which hopefully is a little bit quieter today. It's actually a holiday, and I thought that would mean I'd have the morning to record, but it just meant everyone was out enjoying their lives. Lots of children playing. Gosh, horrible. So hopefully we will only have a few soothing motor sounds, and we will be able to get back into the routine that we've been missing for the last few weeks. I have, as a writer, sometimes many projects on the go, but also as an editor, sometimes consumed by other work. And I just haven't had a chance to be able to read, which is one of the things I love most about my genre, and any genre. I love literature. But we've finally gotten back into the practice, which means we are finally able to comment. And I'm looking forward to commenting today on the state of industry through this set of stories, but especially through an update, a very happy update to the editorial for the July issue of Clarkesworld. So we're going back into a routine of doing monthly reviews of Clarkesworld. I'll get caught up, and then we'll move on to August in a few weeks. And I think I have an Asimov set up as well in the interim. And I also have a plan to chat with you about a few indie books that are coming down the pike, and there is also a classic work of science fiction that I'm hoping to revisit, in part in relation to our conversations about industry, because that work from the 1950s and 1960s illustrates quite a different context for writing than we think of today. And that really will tie into the editorial that I want to talk about, or talk around, really, because the editorial is a little out of date. There's now a piece on Neil Clarke's website from August 3rd that explains some of the updates. Ties into a lot of the major industry discourse we've been sharing over the last few videos, and it ties into what I will talk about a little bit in the video on a work by Robert Sheckley down the line. But for now, we're going to focus on the moment. And in the moment, we of course have always tempests in teapots. There are always scandals, rumors, things going wrong, organizations with all kinds of intrigue and sometimes very painful drama. Then there are publications with all kinds of strange things happening behind the scenes that do affect writers and their livelihoods without us fully maybe understanding the broader context or being willing to think about the broader context, because these are institutions. They are so foundational to our understanding of science fiction and fantasy as an industry that we can't imagine that we might need to be thinking a little bit more holistically and collaboratively about how to build a better world for ourselves and our work. And that's where this piece comes in. So before we talk about Clarkesworld, the July issue, in lieu of talking about the editorial, I'm going to read a sizable chunk of this post, because I do think it touches on quite a few issues that we can come back to later on. So Neil Clarke, in the post titled Rebuilding Clarkesworld Subscriptions, gives us a lot of information about the state of the industry. Okay, through one example, but definitely something to read while thinking about how it might also be affecting other work as well. Quote, "Last year, we were informed by Amazon that they were ending their magazine subscription program. We had been in the program for well over a decade, and it had been where the majority of our subscribers received their ebook editions. If you had a Kindle, which is the most popular ebook device, it was extremely convenient and easy to use. The ecosystem was designed so anyone could figure it out. As a result, it was quite popular. There were some downsides for publishers, the biggest being that Amazon treated subscribers as their customers. That was great for things like customer support, but when it came time to help those people move their subscriptions to other services, it became a nightmare. Amazon would not share their contact information with us. We did what we could, but when the program ended, so did thousands of our subscriptions. At the same time, Amazon opted to launch a Kindle Unlimited program for magazines, different terms than the book program. We were among those invited, and the non-negotiable terms included paying us less than half of what we once earned from them. I've described this previously as a hostage situation, and what I mean by that is that we were left with a choice: take the deal or close. Even taking the deal, we weren't sure we'd make it, but the odds were better, so we held our nose and took it. Now that enough time has passed, I can say that taking the bad deal is the reason we survived that year. It gave us the time we needed to make a dent in rebuilding our subscriptions elsewhere. A few months ago, they invited us to renew our existing contract for 3 months, but with an additional 50% cut in revenue. The idea was to move to new terms in July, which, when we did the math, included another steep cut. Thanks to combined cuts, the anticipated revenue was not only insulting, but potentially harmful to our ability to sell subscriptions elsewhere. This time, however, they were open to negotiating, but that didn't work out. As of July 1st, we're no longer in the program. We won't rule out returning, but I'd rate the chances as slim. We were able to walk away from the table for a few reasons. 1, there was overlap between the old and new program, so we socked away that revenue for such an emergency. 2, our subscription rebuilding efforts were more successful than anticipated. 3, the amount offered wouldn't have closed the gap anyway. 4, a sliver of hope that the time allowed by number 1 would be enough to close the subscription gap. In my July editorial, I laid it all out on the table and explained that we still had some time to recover the remaining 347 subscriptions needed to continue. The response was wonderful. Throughout the month, the number creeped downwards. It was in the 130s by the time I wrote our August editorial. That swift response extended the amount of time our reserves would last, and for the first time in a year, I felt confident that we could pull this off. Early on August 1st, Balt Showplace shared my July editorial on Reddit, specifically the print SF Reddit, but it would later spread to others, and we experienced a surge in new subscriptions. The first few days of the month are usually a bit chaotic. It's when a bunch of subscriptions come up for renewals, so there's loss to churn, people not renewing, and a fresh batch of credit card processing errors. It can take a few days to figure out just where the numbers will settle, but it's easy to work out the best and worst case scenarios. The surge left us sitting somewhere between the two. More of the data resolved overnight, and now I can confidently declare we did it. We are now back to the number of subscribers we had before Amazon pulled the plug. What we did not include in our goal was making up for the lost time, recovering the anticipated growth we would have experienced had the program not ended. And I can happily say that the surge has bitten into some of that as well, giving it a great start. What we have now will allow the lights to stay on, our bare minimum line in the sand. Everything that builds on that from here forward will be put towards our continued efforts to pay our staff a living wage. That has been and will continue to be a priority for us. Only a few genre publications have professionally paid staff, and none of those publications were born of the digital era like us. We aim to be the first and believe that it's not only attainable, but a goal worth prioritizing. We hope you agree, and that the ball can keep rolling towards that. Thank you to everyone that has subscribed and boosted and cheered us on. You have no idea how much this means to all of us here. Thank you. What a relief. So this is something that Neil has been writing on for a while. He's always very open about these kinds of pragmatic concerns. And it was especially disorienting, as I've mentioned before, to see the market so anxious about AI, so-called AI, in relation to this nonsense idea that AI stories were somehow going to wipe out all real writers based on their own quality. It's not even close to happening. But in the interim, we did have the artificial intelligence of corporations and their monopolies taking over. And we have not really talked about that as well as we need to. So this is a wonderful case study in exactly how these major conglomerates are definitely affecting our ability to have choice, to have flexibility, to have publishers who can try things, can explore new options. And of course, Neil Clarke, when he talks about pushing towards having a properly paid staff and being the first of the digital generation to hopefully do that, or fully paid staff, is yet another mark of a publication that has always been trying to broaden access and exposure. Clarkesworld has definitely emphatically tried to make itself an international publication in many ways, being one of the first to strongly spearhead paying translators what they're due and giving them proper representation as well. a practice that often kept many works in translation out of print in other publications because there was a reluctance to invest in the fees that one would need to pay for a translator, to give the translator their financial due as well. So the publication has worked for a while to keep forging ahead in a very difficult time, and yet what a summary like this should really identify is that this whole situation needs a collaborative response. We need to think like a collective. And this is difficult sometimes because there is the science fiction and fantasy industry, and then there is the community. And the community includes a lot of fans, a lot of people who are reader writers, passionate in general, and the whole aesthetic, the community, the camaraderie, the personability of many different forums where we now get to talk about our craft and enjoy a lot of the work that is out there. What's maybe not happening and what needs to happen a little bit more is a more of a synchronicity between the business as well as the pleasure. So the community is one thing, and it is fun, fantastic. It follows a lot of emotional moods, so it will rise and fall with the tides of whatever controversy is currently trending on social media or on our back-end forums in a variety of organizations. But through all of that, through that noise, we do need to think about the infrastructure, the ways in which we are going to create pathways for new writers to come up and for writers who have started to come up to be able to continue into a solid mid-career, and to find ways to ensure that even if not everyone can make a full career out of writing, because it is challenging and it is rare, that everyone can still feel like they are presented with a lot of fair opportunities to share their work and to celebrate the work of others. So this is one part of it, and I highly recommend, especially the churn is quite important. Anybody who's ever had any kind of fundraiser or uses any kind of collective creator platform like Patreon knows full well that churn requires you to have a buffer. So the idea of continuing to build on that subscription model is very important. There are annual fundraiser models too, and I recommend, if you love a magazine, you want to see more of it, definitely try your best to promote and support those publications when they come up for their annual fundraising drives as well. But in a larger sense, we just need to talk about the finances. We need to really think pragmatically, because Neil Clarke isn't some disembodied godhead floating around the planet. He is a person. He's a person who started this publication with a vision that was small, modest, growing carefully, consulting constantly with others in the industry, taking notes, sharing his data as he went, growing responsibly, and has put himself in a position of being still one of the most preeminent publications in the genre, and not just in terms of the quality of the work, but also in the payment structures and the kind of fairness that is given to authors. Everything is from slush. Everything is still from slush. You don't have specially solicited work from this publication. It is part of the reason I enjoy reading it so much every month, because I know I'm going to encounter a new voice. I'm going to encounter someone who's bringing a different perspective. And with that in mind, we're now going to shift over to the July issue so we can talk a little bit about the pieces. And now some of you will be able to see the screen, some of you will not. If you can see the screen, you can see the cover art here. I am just right now switching my own screens so that I can pull up my little notes with all of the names and such. But it is a really beautiful, soothing, meditative piece. You know, the funny thing is, if I had any notes, I would almost say this feels like a November issue. But then again, it was my first thought, because it has such a field of red, and that of course comes down to remembrance. But I think that it actually is better not to be a November issue, because that would tie it too much to one theme or one concept that we already have as humans. So instead we just have this humanoid, artificial being standing rigid, upright, in a very soothing field of red flora. And there's a sort of gray background, so the tones are quite nice. You have this sort of light gray sky, which has a sense of a contemplative mood, leading into a dark underside in the bottom, the bottom quarter of the image under the flowers. There's something about this piece that ties into what we've talked about before, which is that some of the strongest science fiction has to wait out the sound of an emergency vehicle coming past, of course, in the background, but has this tension between the artificial, the natural, and the human. And of course, it always deals with the flexibility of borders between those, what is human, what is non-human animality, and nature in general, and what is human versus what is artificial. But in a piece like this, again, Clarkesworld does these tensions so well. Sometimes it's with size, and sometimes it's just with that stark difference, that holding in tension of two different kinds of ecosystem. One hinted at through the existence of this artificial being, and the other in full bloom around it, with some white flowers as well. So the white and red flowers in the photo image. And this is Robot in a Flower Field 02 by Ninja Joe. So that is our opening visual that leads us into the collection of stories, which we will now move through more or less in order. It's funny, I note that sometimes websites are a little bit flexible in design, so depending on how I have scaled my screen, one order emerges for the stories, and otherwise I will do it one column and the other. So there's no bias in terms of how I'm moving through it. It just honestly depends if I have the screen open with two columns or one. But today we're going to start with Every Hopeless Thing by Tashiro, and this story, like many of them, just like the cover, has this notion of reminiscence. I found that in this issue, the stories often invoked for me a lot of memories of other work, which is great. Not every single piece, but quite a few of them for me had those resonance points, and perhaps for you might, when reading them, find different ones. So if I had to suggest that there might be an overarching through line for the work, it would be that kind of reminiscence. Now, the first kind of reminiscence is quite literal. I mean, we could also say it's a little bit of a Wall-E story, but it is also quite literally an individual going back to an old dead Earth. Not quite for nostalgia, they're scavenging, they're looking for things. So Aeliou and her robot ship, Skipper, are paying a visit to this dead Earth to see what they can see, to see what they can salvage. And on this trip, unfortunately, they don't really find much in the way of salvage. What they do find is that they are not alone on this world. There is, in fact, something else. And considering how irradiated the surface is, that's quite shocking for Aeliou. And so Aeliou and Skipper have to handle the situation that emerges when they encounter a young being on the planet, and then follow this young being to their home. I don't want to spoil the story. Again, I don't really believe in spoilers necessarily, but in this case, I will say that the overarching thrust of this piece is the fact that Aeliou has not come alone to the planet. Well, yes, Skipper's with her, but Aeliou's also brought certain ideas about how to live and how to survive. And those ideas are going to be challenged by what she encounters during this particular trip. And it's a fairly optimistic story. It has a very kind ending, a light piece, reflective, meditative, gentle reminder that what we might consider to be impossible as a situation just sometimes requires a different perspective on what it means to invest in something that matters to you. So with that in mind, I don't want to share any more of that story, but it's a really good introduction to, I feel like this is an issue that has a lot of reminiscence built into it, because she is literally going back to Earth many, many times, bringing her preconceptions with her, and finally learning to change some of her points of view. So that's our opener. Then we move on to Amal Singh's I Will Meet You When the Artifacts End. Now, again, tooting horns in the background might happen every now and then, but I'm going to assume that truck was just very excited by this story too. So, and in fact, the funny thing about this truck is that it's perfect for this story, because this story very much put me in mind of other work I've been reading recently from a South Asian context, and I just love the way that it is navigating the generation ship trope. There are so many works that have come out of that subgenre talking about the ways that we might live while in transit to other worlds. So there are questions of ethics. There are questions of hope and whether our hopes are unrealistic. What do we do with disappointment on the other side? This story is very much filled with a kind of chaos that reflects many circumstances right here on Earth. We have 2 generation ships on their way to Sonagra Prime, and on them there are a variety of different cultures moving in different, not quite separate classes, not quite separate populations by any clear demographic metric, but they have nonetheless been divided, and the fate of certain members depends on which group they're in with respect to how the ships are managing resources for everyone on board. There's a sense of, in this piece, that individuals don't really have that much agency. They are here on this mission, they're caught up in something bigger than themselves, and it's given these generation ships the same sort of chaotic feel that you rightfully get from some stories set in large urban spaces, which often come up in South Asian stories set especially in their larger cities. And what happens in these pieces is that you have stories that can be deep and meaningful and powerful, filled with wonderful relationships, and also there's not really always an expectation of a clean ending or a clean break, because life in a big city, life in a multitude that is constantly in flux, is going to have some very abrupt ends and a lot of unfinished business, and you won't always get the answers to questions that you're asking about yourself. Our sense of purpose, especially in the Western world, we have a very individualist notion of destiny and trajectory, and our stories as a result sometimes will not allow for the reality even in the West. It's not as if one kind of reality happens in the West and one kind of reality happens elsewhere. Many people in the West don't get to live out truly individualist lives. They don't really get to be full masters of their destiny, if any of us ever are. But in this piece, you really do get that sense of empathy and compassion for the kinds of stories that we can build for ourselves even when we don't have all the answers. So we follow Nouri, who's working on one of these generation ships, and at the beginning is a voice in many ways. She has a program that she speaks on every morning, soothing every morning might not be the right word because we're in a generation ship, but every day the program that she puts out soothes people. It provides care. It provides a sense of a humanizing presence in the middle of a lot of work that can sometimes be very dehumanizing. And she herself, though, feels kind of lonely, and she tries to connect through an online app, and she connects with someone named Jai, who seems to be of a slightly different culture, has a slightly different way of pronouncing things. There are different ways of pronouncing and speaking about the world they're in, but also has a different communication style, so they don't quite connect as intimately and as cleanly as she might want. It's hard to say if she wants, because she's still grieving another loss that came before the story that we never really get a full clean ending on either. And Nouri and Jai's story is not going to end cleanly, because the ship is going to arbitrarily decide that some people need to be put into long-term cryo, knocking people out of a generational timeline with others, all in service of getting the vast bulk of these populations to the new world in more or less in one piece. And so all of these slings and arrows of surrounding fortune make it very difficult to create a sense of self and coherent story, and yet this compassionate piece definitely shows how one can live around that and create meaning for oneself around it. So that is a nice one. Grant Collier's The Best Version of Yourself comes next, and again, when we're talking about memory, this piece definitely is in the present, but with a lot of flashback to what's happened before, and we are struggling to put the two stories together, not in a negative way, but we're moving towards something. We're moving towards an interaction, a confrontation. We gradually get the world through the story of Maria and her mother, who have very complex interactions. Her mother's not a happy person. Her mother has a lot that she relies on her daughter tremendously, and she feels very bad about that sometimes. There's one comment at one point about how she realizes that her daughter very much is her best friend, but she knows that she isn't Maria's. So she's not happy in the circumstances she's living in. She's living in a society that is gradually, or maybe not so gradually, being overrun by a solution to this kind of unhappiness. And this world literally absolutely covered in many places by joy jelly, this substance that represents an end product of a process. The eudaimon procedure is pitched as the sort of cure-all that's going to help remodel brains to move toward their happiest, best selves. And there's this lovely tie-in, this gentle metaphor that's being used in terms of tree and growth and the roots that we have positive associations with, even though we might not necessarily trust or have positive associations with this substance and this process if we're on the outside of its expansion into our world, slowly consuming the world one brain at a time, but never in an aggressive way. The product just works so well that brains gradually move towards a state of indifference to external phenomena, because they can always change their reaction, their attitude toward it, that leads the brains to detach. Why do we even really need a body? We can join something else. We can join a bigger hive mind. So there are a lot of things going on in this piece, and it is one just to sit with in terms of letting it roll over you instead of trying to necessarily solve all of it, because it's creating a space to reflect on a lot of that underlying tension in our lives between wanting to be happy, wanting things to be better, but not wanting necessarily to lose ourselves and what makes us ourselves in the process. Or do we? Is that the entire point? Is that actually the ache that underlies a lot of our pain? Do we only just have a hesitancy because we haven't arrived at that nirvana, that greater state where surely all of these small considerations and anxieties for our sense of self will be wiped away? Maria has to decide whether to honor her old mother's wishes or her new mother's wishes in the course of the story. And that means also dealing, just like with another story we talked about, Elodie, preconceptions that she has and that the reader will share as you go through them, because the person she talks to at one key juncture will represent points of view that aren't necessarily going to be sympathetic or ones that we would sympathize with, but they do represent a compelling other way of thinking about the world. It's just a choice, whether you decide to reframe your mind to agree with that point of view or not. So again, how we construct our sense of memory, our sense of self comes through a lot. And again, that interesting divide between the fact that many of us do have this sense of wanting to return to something bigger than ourselves anyway. So does it really matter if it's a seed for a tree planted with our body, or if it's a broader sense of consciousness, the cosmos that lies in a lot of spiritual traditions, or if it's joy jelly? Where does the line get drawn between those elements in terms of what is okay, what is good, what is worth aspiring toward, and what is actually quite grim and horrific and something to be reviled? All a matter of choice. So that one as a good chewy bunch of really important science fiction themes in it. MX Lieu's Stellar Evolutions in Pop Idol Artistry was also a fun one, in part because I immediately thought about another piece that had, I'm not going to say it has a similar premise, but it has a similar set of guiding plot devices. And I think that there's something in that. I think we are seeing the rise of maybe a new subgenre of work, which would make sense. There are a lot of surrounding visual arts and musical arts that are informing science fiction today, and one of them is definitely K-pop, and around that all kinds of boy bands from many different parts of the world, but especially a lot of Asian cultures right now. It's huge. And so I'm not entirely surprised that we would get the idea of fandom, the idea of being a star, of being an idol, of being a pop celebrity, the parasocial relationships that come with it, being tied with a classic science fiction setting of space. But it was quite amusing because Clarkesworld a few years ago published a piece by Grace Chan, He Leaps for the Stars, He Leaps for the Stars, and there we do have a star who has a kind of relationship with their fans that is really important. Everyone's monitoring everything while doing their performances on Enceladus. And in this story, Ceres is our base of operations for another pop star, someone who's a profound celebrity and also has a contract that involves a lot of allowance for idol worship built in, and all kinds of ways to make money through those parasocial relationships. So again, it makes perfect sense. In the stars, we have a star, but it also reflects a huge component of our culture, and that is also what science fiction is supposed to do, is to reflect the moments we are moving through. And this one just happens to be one that has a lot of K-pop and other boy bands that have very strange, fascinating, soap operatic relationships on one level, that on another level are just affecting their ability to be human beings, normal human beings. I don't know if such a thing exists. So as a result, that's the real question in the story. We have a story of stars in space. We have two career paths in terms of moving through space, and then also in space being a celebrity on tour for another reason, not just because you're in space, but because you are a singer or just famous for its own sake. Works really well to create questions about what we lose about ourselves along the way. So Ming Ming is our star, and in the middle of a contract, in the middle of a tour, caught up in the workouts, the routines, the performances, so much, just thoroughly invested in this role of performing every moment of the day in one way, shape, or form, that there is this strange moment when it turns out that maybe the people who, I don't know if we can say own them, but definitely have control over his career, his life, hint at a completely new direction for him, which might also not be a new direction for him. I don't want to spoil the work again, although again, spoiling is such a silly concept, but there is this important twist in the middle of this heaving moment where you are just immersed in this culture of being a celebrity, being a musician, when things are revealed that illustrate that all of this, which has been so important for Ming Ming, which has been so important, it has been his life, it's been his identity, might also just be one phase of something that he doesn't necessarily have full control over. And so this ties into maybe one of the other stories we were talking about, Amal Singh's piece, is how much we are really in control of our destiny. Here's someone who's at the top of the world, center of attention, but what agency do they really have, even over their identity, even over who they are and who they have been or who they will be? And then how, in the middle of that, if that is your life, do you create a sense of self and story that allows you to move forward? So again, some really interesting overlaps. Okay, and again, I think it would be an interesting companion read to go back and read Grace Chan's piece as well in contrast. They're different stories, but some overarching elements are similar enough that it is interesting to think about it as a rising, maybe not full subgenre, but a common setting now, or a common structure in which to tell stories. Okay, next we have Natalia Theodoridou's Aktis, Aeliou, or The Machine of Margot's Destruction. And if we want to talk about reminiscence, I mean, this story is adapting Greek mythology for space. It's Greek mythology in space. Okay, I'm a little bit biased because I am, of course, in the middle of a trilogy that's based on ancient history being brought into space. But I love seeing people bring those stories forward, because that's the way stories should work. We are supposed to be carrying forward the best and the most important aspects of our past. We can all decide what is the most important in different ways, but here we have a figure, and the juxtaposition is always between something larger than life and something much more tangible, something that we can access and approach. We have Margot, who is, trucking along, doing her work. She's a space explorer of some type. She has her missions. And this mission is to, in this case, she's following a curious signal to a planet where she ends up crash landing. But on top of that, she's somebody who is trying to deal with a broken heart in many ways, because she has had a really rough childhood first that left her to feel that love was necessarily tied up in harm. This story hit me very personally. It's definitely how I had a very rough childhood. And so for me as well, that concept of love and care being something that shows up in how you endure and your ability to be hurt by other people is very painful sometimes to recall. And yet, on top of that, in this story, Margot also has a life, an adult version of that in a relationship that she's holding on to for too long. The person has already very much ghosted her, and she just hasn't quite caught up to it. She's still in the sense of that pain is love, and so she doesn't really know how to go forward. Which is a great time to meet a god. So she's meeting essentially Helios is the god that's been used as the framework for the story. And he's just chilling on the planet. Maybe many planets, again, fluidity for these god forms. And at first when I was reading it, I thought it might be that they were an alien that we had mistaken as a god in the past, because this person has visited Earth in the past. But later on, we get the feeling that that's not the case. So there is kind of fluidity. This is kind of science fantasy. And yet this figure is intrigued, wanted to be left alone for a while, had his own god things going on, his own issues, but also is learning a little bit about this critter for whom love and harm are necessarily intertwined, longs to be obliterated by love. And so it is kind of a love story in the way that only, I guess, Greek mythology can be. But it is this very confident retelling of an aspect of Greek mythology comfortably to reflect on an aspect of something that's quite pertinent to a lot of us. I'm no longer in that space, but Margot definitely gave me some flashbacks for sure to an era when there was still a way of trying to move through pain. And how do we move through pain? Well, for a lot of us, it is through story. So Greek mythology, other myths, and other narratives that we tell ourselves are often to try to heal something or to obliterate something in ourselves one way or another. One other thing I really loved about this story, and again, why I think this whole issue is very much about reminiscence, is that there was a shout out to Iris Murdoch, which is Iris Murdoch is an author I quite love, and The Sea is one of my favorite novels, so I was also kind of biased by the fact it was present here. But the thing is, most folks, I think, who read this story will not know who Iris Murdoch is, maybe, I don't think most of them will have read The Sea, and it's not necessary to have read it to enjoy this piece, but it adds that extra little something to have those layers of mythology. And Iris Murdoch, I think, is a good choice here because, and it's specifically The Sea, the novel involves a playwright who thinks that they're essentially the center of the universe, or not just playwright, theater director, and now in retirement is now looking for the next big adventure, the next big performance, the next big theatrical story to tell about himself. So he is very much caught between a life of being at the center, very much kind of demigod-esque, and the quotidian realities of actually just being a human, and life not always being a perfect adventure, and stories not ending well, and things being destroyed along the way. So there are these lovely layers that you get. You get this as well in Amal Singh's piece I didn't mention, but there was also a reference to some classic singers there too, which I think will have strong resonance, along with certain cues that hint at different sub-communities from Earth cultures. For those who recognize the touch points, it should invoke quite a bit of sense memory and bring back a body of affective relationships to the work. So, is it the last one or no? We have two more pieces. Anamaria Curtis is The Happiness Institute. And again, we have another story about building happiness. There are always these lovely contrasts, which makes it pleasant to read these works together or in one sitting, because we have the best version of yourself has a kind of happiness experiment, product, and here we have an institute that's oddly named for a bunch of people who very clearly grew up in a really hard war scenario and with a lot of severity, a lot of limits onto their dreaming about what is possible. And again, when you read this, I certainly got an immediate feeling of Sense8, if anybody remembers that series, in the major concept that ends up playing out in the piece later on. But it's reworked here, and it comes through technology. And in fact, that's part of what makes this such an interesting story, is that these folks who have been given a set of operations to do, they are quite functional because their whole life seems to have been reduced to functionality, finally have some opportunities to do projects of their own and to grow as people a little bit, each one trying to do their work to help to create happiness in their own way in a very strange post-war world. But the technology that they can use to try to create happiness includes some things that one among them recognizes as technology that might have been used to very bad ends in the war. And so then the question really comes here about how we reconstitute the worst parts of ourselves and our past to build something better. And the other thing I really enjoy about this piece is that it's quite disturbing without necessarily that being its intent. It has a sense of everyone joining in slowly through this technology in a very sensient way to a broader collective. And you're not really left with a sense of whether, when one final character makes a choice in a certain direction, you're supposed to agree with that choice or not. Is it a good thing or is it not? Just like with Grant Collier's piece, that's all about perspective. What is necessary to be happy? How do we move forward? And what is acceptable to use from the world that came before in order to get us to something better? So some thought-provoking sci-fi that doesn't quite spell things out for you but allows you to sit with a concept, is quite potent. And the last one for us is Polenth Blake. And I love that the last piece in these issues tends to be the smallest one, but they pack a punch. And again, for reminiscence, truly this has to be an homage to the Body Snatchers. There's no way that this person is not in some way writing this piece to carry the story forward. And they do it in such a clever way. They put you in a position of empathizing with the pod people. And I'm not going to share too much, but the way that from the pod people's perspective, you get to see the fragility of life and growth and really tie in that sense of floral notions of death and rebirth with faunal notions, or at least human notions of death and rebirth among some cultures, is really quite deftly done. It is a brief piece, but this one has so much in it. And so sometimes I'm not very good at writing at short lengths myself. I'm a very long-winded person, but I do truly admire people who can build a whole world in such a tight space. So that was a really good closer. And then we go in to the nonfiction sections. D.A. Xiaolin's Spires has a follow-up to another piece on bees. So in another issue, the May issue, I believe, there was a piece on bees in space. And now we're carrying forward to hive minds and drones, bees, Earthside, and futuristic tech and science fiction. So we're looking at production, and production in many different ways. Human honey consumption is very important. One of the reasons we care so much for bees is very selfish. They bring us things. Not directly, but we help them bring us things. And then the other elements here, there's just a laundry list in some ways of different kinds of products that we have created from the notion of the bee. So artificial bees and bee-inspired technology, mechanical concepts of drones, and broader abstract concepts of cooperation. The hive mind trope in general in literature, along with more literal transformations where we have our human characters becoming bees or becoming bee-like. So we are looking in this piece as a lovely companion to the one, the earlier piece, as bees becoming more than themselves, commodity, technology, concept. And again, these lovely essays are so wonderful. There aren't that many spaces in the genre for them. You'll find places like Analog will have these science fact essays as well, but they are potent for readers to help them reflect on what they're reading, and for writers. There's just such a wealth here. If ever any of you is ever looking for an inspiration for a story, go through some of these archives. There's a wonderland and treasure trove of discussions about different ways that certain concepts have been used in fiction. And I truly, D.A. Xiaolin Spires fiction is lovely. The nonfiction, I just feel, is a whole other beast of really useful, wonderful work. Then we get to Arley Sorg, who has 2 interviews for us. As always, I don't know how Arley Sorg does this. His schedule must be very packed because he works in many different spaces and he's constantly reading and reviewing. Very grateful for these pieces because for years he has provided this accessible window into early, mid, and late career writers. So you get to see all of the challenges and the mess and the confusion that in other spaces might be streamlined to one story of how a person got to fame and then held on to it forever. But here it gets to be as complicated as life. So today we actually do have 2 pieces of fairly established writers who have wonderful, comprehensive careers behind them. So in the first piece, Stories That Stick in the Brain, a conversation with Donna Scott, we're talking to an author who, although they have for many, many generations lived in West Midlands in England, not just her family, so very much of one area, has a rich history in writing and advocating for British literature in general and for bringing it to the world, both with personal writing and also as an editor. So this interview celebrates the best of British science fiction 2023, and I honestly, there was one part of this interview that just made me chuckle. She asks the question, can British science fiction, one second, I am shrinking my screen a little tiny bit too much. There we go. Can British science fiction rank alongside world science fiction? What a question. And such a wonderful question, because I think it really highlights the fact that our genre has shifted so much now that we do have a proper, I don't want to say competition like it's a death match or anything, but it's not guaranteed at all anymore, and it never should have been, that certain writers from certain regions are always going to have a kind of dominance over narrative. So in this interview, she reflects on some regional differences in style that have emerged from British writing in contrast with, say, Chinese science fiction, which is more philosophical. We've talked about it before. There's a lot more philosophy and history that comes into Chinese science fiction in different ways, and exposition in general. And then there's the direct storytelling of the United States. And then British prose tends to have some more socio-historical intricacies to it. It just has more of a comfort talking about certain kinds of historical contexts. So this piece is a wonderful introduction to her as an editor, which should in turn give you a good sense of the kind of curation she's done in this collection. The next interview is with someone who's pretty darn famous in sci-fi. Imperfectly Transparent, a conversation with China Miéville, and he's a British writer as well, but he's got worldly experience. He's got academic chops, prominent schools in the United States as well as in Britain and in the UK. And he is especially well known. He resides in London now. He came very much into fame with King Rat, and that established him with a kind of aesthetic that is distinctly his own in many ways across styles, genres, topics. I would call it maybe kind of a haphazard flinging into adventure, because his characters very often don't really have full agency. They're pulled this way and that, whether it's by fantastical beings or by extraordinary science fantastical events. But there is just this intensity that comes out of a lot of his work. And even in pieces that have a little bit of a mystery bent, a sort of noir-esque feel, there's a propulsive energy to them. He slows down for one novella. Yeah, he does cover quite a range, but there's always just something very much, you when you read him, you know you're reading Miéville. And he's currently promoting The Book of Elsewhere, which is a collaboration with another person who very much throws himself into things, Keanu Reeves. And Keanu Reeves had created a comic series, developed it with writer Matt Kint and artist Ron Garney, and now it's become a book because, again, Miéville is well situated, Reeves is well situated as well. It's no surprise they already have a live-action Netflix film and anime series in the works, so this is a really well-established writer. But this is where the Arley Sorg touch comes in, is it's never just about this one sensational piece or moment. In the middle of this, or actually near the end of the interview, we also find out that Miéville has his mind also on a piece currently out with publishers that was 19 years in the making and that he's looking forward to seeing realized soon. And that should be a humbling little note, a reminder. Even people who are accomplished, absolutely have more access to a lot of resources, can get the green light a lot faster in a lot of ways, still can't necessarily tell all the stories they want to, maybe in the way that they want to. I don't know if the 19 years in the making is because this work was rejected, this work was pushed back, this work agents and editors told him, that's not quite right for us right now, or if he, as a writer, didn't feel like he was fully ready, prepared to finish the work. Who knows? But writers are humans. They're not just these people who shoot up to celebrity status, just like suggested in one of the stories today. They have messy, complicated CVs. And we do get that grounded approach to people in this publication in Arley Sorg's interviews. So again, that brings us full circle. This has been a fun one, a long one. We've had a lot to talk about for sure. But go take a look through the notes, read through Neil Clarke's piece yourself, pop through a few stories. Future episodes, of course, will be back to a more moderate length, but I did want to talk about that editorial first. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your patience, any of you who might have been looking forward to the next one. Hopefully we'll be getting better at these as I go, and we will talk about more science fiction then. So cheers, thank you so much. I appreciate everyone who's subscribed. If you are so inclined, liking and subscribing actually does do things behind the scenes to allow me in the future to do more things with YouTube, because again, tying into our Amazon discussion, it's all about big corporations, so no pressure, but much obliged if you do sign up for more. Thanks so much. Have a great afternoon.